Hi, and welcome to the channel. Here we share stories that touch the soul. Enjoy listening.
They say money can't buy happiness. Believe me, as a guy who worked in a bank for 40 years, that is a straight-up lie. It buys happiness, just not for you. I'm Harry Miller, former vice president of the Texas First Private Bank. If you ever took out a home loan back in the 90s, there's a good chance I signed your application, pretending not to notice the fear in your eyes. My life was always structured, like an Excel sheet. Columns, rows, formulas that closed out to a nice, neat zero at the end. Now, it's a zero without the formula. Retirement. That word used to sound like a reward. Now it sounds like a sentence. My house is in an Austin suburb. Red brick, a lawn that I don't mow anymore because who am I trying to impress? The neighbors are either dead or have hearing aids better than my TV speakers. When the wind blows past, the blinds rattle, and I like to imagine it's applause. At least someone still appreciates me. Every morning I wake up at 6, old habit. Of course, waking up for no reason isn't discipline anymore, it's self-torture. I brew coffee in a machine that I think is older than some of my former bank colleagues. It wheezes, it spits, but it puts out a drink that shares at least two things with actual coffee. It's black and it's hot. Then I sit by the window, look out at the street, and count cars. If there are more than 5 in an hour, it's a good day. I used to count millions. Now it's Fords and Chevys. I remember my last day at the bank. My assistant, the 25-year-old metrosexual in a tie the color of burgundy with a hint of unattainability, walked into the office and handed me an envelope. "Mr. Miller, the board has decided on a, rest period." He said it like he wasn't sending me into retirement, but to a spa for transplanted cacti. Then they threw a party. A cake that said, "For loyalty and integrity," a photo for the internal newsletter, a plastic tasting glass of champagne. They gave me a silver pen engraved with, "Thank you for your years of service." I remember thinking, service to who? The next morning, I woke up with no calls, no meetings, no schedule. It turns out the scariest thing about old age isn't the loneliness, it's the silence. The bank was always full of ringing phones, rustling papers, someone running around with a folder. And at home, just the refrigerator humming like it's trying to empathize with me. My son, David, lives in San Francisco. He has a startup that optimizes user financial behavior. In other words, he's creating an app that tells people not to buy a $5 cup of coffee. I guess I wasn't the greatest father. I taught him how to count money, but I didn't teach him how to enjoy it. He calls me every Saturday. "How you doing, Dad?" "Still alive, David." "That's great. I just closed a new round of funding." "Good job. Don't forget to pay your taxes." "You never change." And we both laugh because we have to cover up the fact that we've run out of things to talk about. Sometimes I think life after the bank is like a cash register with no customers. It still works, but there's no point anymore. I tried to take a photography class, bought a camera, took 200 pictures of my own backyard, and realized I'm not a photographer. I'm just an old guy with an overpriced toy. Tried golf. They kicked me out after the 3rd hole for language-violating club etiquette. Who knew the phrase, "goddamn sand trap," was so forbidden in golf? Last week, I ran into Richard Lawrence, one of my old clients. He was leaving a restaurant where the coffee cups cost more than my breakfast. "Harry," he yelled, like we were buddies from kindergarten. "Don't you recognize me?" I did. The same guy I'd once saved from bankruptcy by letting him refinance. He was crying back then. Now he was shining like a brand new bill. "How you doing, old-timer?" Asks. "Retired," I say. "Congratulations. Well, you earned the rest." He got into his Tesla, waved, and drove off. Rest. I wonder what he thought I was resting from. From intellect? From purpose? When I got home, I opened the closet and saw that silver pin. For loyalty and integrity. I looked at it for a long time, and for the first time I thought, maybe integrity is an overrated asset, like a zero-yield CD. The next morning, I opened my old briefcase, the same one I carried to work for 20 years. The leather was cracked, the zipper stuck, but inside was the archive of my life. Copies of deals, notes, client profiles. Richard was in there. His signature, his safe deposit box, his address. I looked at those numbers and felt something click inside me, quietly, like a lock that was ready to open again. I wasn't planning anything bad, just curiosity, professional deformation. I used to know everything. Who owed who had what weaknesses, where they kept not just their money, but their fears. You know what's the most dangerous thing about a person who's lost everything? Not anger. Curiosity. I pulled my old suit out of the closet. It fit weirdly. My stomach stuck out like an unpaid loan. But in the mirror, I looked almost like a former banker. Gray hair, glasses, neat. I even found a tie with gold stripes, the one they gave me once for exemplary staff leadership. Now I'm my own staff and my own client all at once. I put that same silver pen in my pocket, a symbol of a past life. If honesty was my asset, I guess it's time for its liquidation. I didn't know where this would lead, but after 2 years without a purpose, even the idea of just checking if I remember how the system works seemed like entertainment. Most guys my age collect stamps or grow tomatoes. I collect former clients. And frankly, there's a certain romance to it.
If you've ever retired, you know this. The first few weeks feel like a vacation just without a return ticket. I'd wake up at 7, even though I didn't need an alarm anymore, brew my coffee, and open the newspaper. The old paper kind, because I'm a dinosaur who still loves the feel of ink on his fingers. And every morning I'd catch myself reading the financial news, just like I used to. Except now nobody was paying me to worry about the numbers. My wife, Mabel, kept telling me I needed to relax. That was her favorite word, relax. She'd say it with a look like it was the magic spell that could cure all the ailments of old age. "Relax, Harry, you earned it," she'd tell me when I tried to give advice to a guy on a financial news show. But how can you relax when the whole world around you suddenly starts looking like one endless accounting error? Everything irritated me. The neighbor who mowed his lawn every Saturday like he was trying to scalp the earth itself. The local kids who drank beer outside the convenience store and laughed loudly like they knew some secret I'd never find out. And most of all, the silence. The silence after 30 years of calls, numbers, clients, deals, and nerves. It wormed its way into my head like the IRS into a tax return and left a void. One day, sometime in mid-April, I happened to run into Jack Reynolds, downtown, one of my old clients. Jack was one of those successful guys who always smelled like an advertisement for expensive living. Suit, watch, a $3,000 smile. I once helped him secure the loan for his third house. Now he owned 5. We crossed paths near a coffee shop. He recognized me, but pretended he didn't. And I pretended not to notice that he was pretending he didn't recognize me. Classic bank game. Except now, I was without a tie, without a purpose, without a business suit. And in that moment, I suddenly found it funny. I watched him get into his brand-new Mercedes and thought, "Oh, you old fox, you used to be scared you couldn't even afford the property tax. And now, look at you, and look at me.
We switched places without signing a single agreement. I sat on the porch for a long time at home. It smelled like rain and old age, and at some point it dawned on me, if Jack came by now and asked me to spot him for a couple of days, I'd probably believe him again. Because all my life I trusted people who had clean suits and dirty hands. And that, damn it, was the worst kind of naivete. I can't say that's the moment the idea of a crime was born. No, it was just a joke, an ironic thought like 1,000 others. But as often happens with jokes, this one was too good to forget. The next morning, I opened the old notebook where I used to track client expenditures, and I wrote across the top line, assets that should have been mine. Below that, names. Jack Reynolds, Michael Sloan, Gary Travis, all the ones who once walked into my office with a smile and walked out with a loan, paid for by other people's sweat and nerves. At first, I laughed. Then I stopped. It turned out the thought of adjusting the balance a little didn't sound like a crime at all, more like accounting justice. I wasn't drawn to violence or drama. I just wanted to even out the numbers, just a bit. That same week, I went back to my old bank for the first time. Not as a customer, just taking a walk, I told myself. The lobby smelled like coffee and fresh money. The young bankers in their ties reminded me of ants, busy but without a clue why they were doing it. I stood in line, watched their hands quickly typing in numbers, and suddenly felt a strange, almost physical pleasure. I was drawn back to the game, but this time not by the rules. As I was leaving the bank, someone touched my shoulder. Harry? Harry Denton? I turned around. Standing in front of me was Sarah Wilkins, a former colleague. Now she seemed to be a deputy director. "Oh, my God, you haven't changed a bit," she said. And I almost burst out laughing, because of course I had changed. She just didn't want to see it. "Retirement," I replied. "The worst thing that can happen to a man accustomed to power." "Oh, don't say that. You've earned a rest." Rest is when you stop just before death, but haven't noticed that you're standing still. She laughed, and I thought, if I ever go through with what I'm thinking about, I'll start with you, Sarah, because you always loved nice, neat numbers. I went home and sat down at the computer. Google is a scary thing for old people with too much time. I typed in untraceable ways to access private property. Then, how to open a safe without key. 5 minutes later, YouTube ads started offering me videos with the words perfect heist plan and retired man's revenge. The algorithm knew me better than any psychiatrist. And while I was watching yet another video on simplest lockpicking techniques, I was laughing at myself. Mabel, hearing the laughter from the kitchen, asked, "What's so funny in there?" "Oh, just a video about retirement. Everyone thinks it's the ending, but actually it's the prologue." That evening, I took my old bank ID badge out of a drawer. Metal, little tarnished, with my name, Harry Benton, Senior Account Manager. I turned it over in my hands and thought, Senior Account Manager. That's right, Harry. It's time to manage other accounts my way. When I went to bed, I had a strange dream. I was standing in a huge vault, alone among rows of safe deposit boxes. They were breathing like living things, and they whispered, "You're too late, Harry." I woke up in cold sweat, but for some reason, I smiled. Mabel was sleeping next to me. I looked at her and thought, it's a good thing you'll never know what I'm up to. It would ruin your sleep. The next morning, I decided to start the plan. Not a real plan, just a mental exercise for now. I opened my old laptop, launched Excel, and created a spreadsheet titled Potential Targets. In the first column, names. In the second, assets.
In the third, risk. And in the fourth, as a joke, karma balance. It looked so absurd that I laughed again. But when I put the first check mark in the opportunity column, I realized the jokes were over. And somewhere between the numbers and the memories, I felt that old, forgotten feeling return. Not adrenaline, control. That's how a criminal is born. Not through anger, not through need, not through insanity. But because the world suddenly stops being interesting and you have to invent a new game for yourself. Starting is always the scary part. Just like the first signature in a diary. Your hand shakes, the pen feels heavier, and the first words sound awkward. My hand was shaking the same way, only instead of a pen, I was holding a list, my Excel sheet, printed on an old printer that was suspiciously hissing. A first withdrawal sounded dramatic. I never called operations that in the bank. Everything there was dry. Transaction no, credit line, refinancing. But in my head, it was different. When you decide to cross a line, it starts to have its own aesthetic. The first target was Jack Reynolds. Not because he was the richest, though he was close, but because he was so typical, he felt like a caricature to me. Old money and new rapping. A man who knows how to laugh louder than others when he needs to drown out his conscience. He always looked like he'd only gone bankrupt in his dreams. I looked at the notes, the address of his estate, his personal accountant's name, the number of his private safe deposit box where some official documents were kept. I added one more column to that entry. Vulnerability. And there, a note. Maid who's afraid of being fired, poor lighting near the side entrance, and Jack's evening dog walks. It didn't sound like a plan. It sounded like a picnic list, but this picnic was on someone else's lawn, at night, without the owner's permission. I didn't want the money, at least not in the traditional sense. I wanted the feeling. You know, when you work with other people's money at the bank, you have power, but it's grim and distant, like turning on a light with your phone. Here it was different. You were physically touching things that were once inaccessible. That's a whole different kind of intimacy. The plan was simple in its shamelessness. I didn't want to break anything. I don't like the shock of a stopped heart. I wanted to be elegant about it. As an old banker, I believed in documents, in forged signatures, in the weak spots in the private lives of rich people. Step 1, reconnaissance. I sat in my car, a block from the estate, hidden in the darkness, phone on airplane mode. Paranoia is sometimes a useful trait. I watched. Neighbors are the best free research center. They see everything, but never remember anything in detail. In an hour, I noted the routine. Jack goes out with the dog around 9:30 p.m., the light by the side entrance turns off automatically at 11 p.m., the maid returns at 9:45 and rarely stays past 10 p.m. Easy. Step 2, necessary disguise. I had no desire to look like a cliché criminal. Black balaclava, backpack, dramatic music. No. I bought a plain baseball cap, a cotton jacket, and looked like I had just wandered in for a breath of night air. People buy drama at the movies. I was buying inconspicuousness. Step 3, the elegant lie. I needed to gain the trust of someone who had access to the interior. The maid, whose name I now remembered, was Marta. She looked tired and worried. She was afraid of being fired because she had a grandfather under her care. I wrote in my notebook, sensitivity equals high. That meant I had to be delicate with her. I approached the side entrance with a box featuring a delivery service logo. A novice in action always looks more believable than a professional. People don't expect a novice. They think, oh, a mistake, and walk away. I knocked, adopting a light tone. Evening, delivery for Reynolds. And I immediately added, sign here, sir. Marta opened the door, smiling with the cautious politeness typical of people afraid to say too much. She let me in, and I felt a little awkward.
The house smelled of expensive candles and toasted nuts. That's the scent of rich people trying to create an atmosphere of homey warmth with pricey gadgets. I walked into the living room, explained I was a client delivery, and placed a fake receipt on the table. She signed, and I was one step closer to the first transaction, but not the accounting one that I was used to. The sign of a real crime is the anxiety that twists your inner voice, but I had a different kind of excitement, a strategic joy, like in chess when you see a move several steps ahead. I wasn't nervous. I felt control and a strange freedom, as if I'd finally taken off a couple of unnecessary suits that had been restricting my movement. After I left, I mumbled a few words into my phone. Everything went fine. And another one, no, I don't like corporate cake. This was my old-fashioned pleasure, leaving behind small lies like misleading tracks. I waited. Days dragged slowly. I didn't want to rush anything. It would spoil the aesthetic. But the thought that something related to his life might be in the large safe wouldn't leave me alone. Old people collect memories. The rich collect objects. I wanted to touch at least one of them, not for the money, but for the trust that once existed between me and those who brought me folders full of signatures. The next night I went back, more confident. I went through the same door, but not with a box, but in the guise of a casual passerby. It seems like a small thing, but small things make all the difference. I saw the same paintings on the walls, a collection of old photos sitting modestly in expensive frames. The hallway smelled of lavender. The safe was in Jack's personal study, a room that resembled an office, just with more expensive nonsense. In one of our conversations, I once asked him, "Why so many fishing photos?" He replied, "First, a fish is silence. And second, I like to show that I can still hold something in my hands." Funny, right? If he'd known that one day I'd be holding his emerald cufflink, he probably wouldn't have collected fish for photos. I opened the safe with a tool called forced diplomacy, a slip note from security services with a signature that cloned the manager's handwriting. In real life, it looked like a magical combination of my banking routine and a little bit of acting. The safe opened with a quiet click, like an office cabinet admitting defeat. Inside were documents, a few watches, a box of photographs, and a small jewelry case. I took one thing, not a watch, not hundreds, not anything easy to sell. I took a small silver cufflink shaped like a sailboat. It was unassuming, but it had an engraved initial, J.R. It was quite symbolic, like someone had cut off a piece of pride and brought it to me on a platter. I put the item in my pocket and carefully closed the safe. Everything looked as if nothing had happened, but then something happened that couldn't be planned. I heard footsteps. Somewhere in the air, uncertain, slow steps of a person getting up at 11:30 p.m. to check before going to bed. The heart in my chest didn't jump. It performed a small, elegant summary. Interest, 12%. Risk, minimal. It was a joke, my body declared. I hid behind the curtain, which of course I remembered from old visits, held my breath, and imagined a few scenarios. But instead of seeing Jack, I saw Marta, the maid, who had returned because she had forgotten her keys. She moved quietly, like a cat, and opening the door a crack, she stopped silently. Her eyes fell on the table, the case, my shadow. For a moment we looked at each other, and what could have been a disaster turned into a scene from a comedy. We both froze like two actors who forgot their lines. "Oh, excuse me, mister. I thought someone else," she whispered in a voice that seemed sincere to me. I stepped out from behind the curtain, put on the most honest smile I could find, and said, "Marta, I'm just checking the security system. The bank called me to say there are supposed to be maintenance checks tonight." She looked around, doubting, but believing more in the polite man in the suit than in her own instinct. That was the small thing that always worked. People tend to trust those who look like they have authority. I didn't know, she whispered. I'm sorry. I gave her a small bill for her grandfather's medicine. It was part of my code. Yes, a thief can have a code. Mine is a banking one, with notes in the margins. She took the money without looking me in the eye, and she left. We both knew the truth, as if we had read the same old contract. I walked out, feeling the warmth of the silver in my pocket. Adrenaline? Maybe, but it was a deeper, sweeter layer. A reminder that I was in control of something again. Like I had taken an imprint of an old signature and signed a new page. The next morning I looked at the little sailboat in the light of the morning lamp. It was small, a little tarnished with age, and it held a part of his life, a piece of pride that sat in a drawer. When I touched the metal, my heart issued another small formula. Feeling equals priceless. I didn't sell that little sailboat. I kept it as a souvenir. When they ask you why you start, it's always hard to answer. It's not because you need the money. It's always a more complicated story. It's a protest. It's a game to see if you still remember how to make moves that once felt natural. And also, it's a reminder to yourself that you haven't completely disappeared. That under the sleeve of your suit, there's still a pocket where you can hide a surprise. After that night, rumors started popping.
I looked at the silver pen in my hand, cold, shiny, and seemingly completely innocent, just like me. Not a killer, not a thief, just a retiree with shaky hands who took something that wasn't his. But damn, what a pleasant moment it was. Not because of the pen itself, but because of the realization that I still had it in me, that not all was lost, that even now, at 68, I was capable of doing something illegal. Only now did I realize how many years I had lived without risk, and how much risk was the one thing that had kept me alive. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling that something had clicked inside me. Before, morning for coffee, the newspaper, and the soft light from the window. Now, it was for planning. I brewed myself a strong cup of coffee and opened the old folder marked Client Files 1999 to 2017. Yes, I kept the copies. I always found it hard to part with paperwork. On every page was a person's life, their money, their fears, their foolishness. I looked at those names and felt the same fire come alive in me that once burned in the bank's offices. Rachel Goodman, antique collector, lives alone, has a safe in her own home. Richard Crane loves to brag about old paintings that are, between you and me, of questionable origin. Alice Lawrence, a volunteer, but once laundered over $100,000 through her foundation. My former clients weren't just rich, they were interested. People who played with risk, just within the boundaries of the law. And here I was, old Harry Miller, who knew all their weaknesses, sitting in his kitchen with a cup of coffee, like a detective who had just received a list of suspects. I was captured by the planning itself, not the stealing, the process. It was like assembling a financial portfolio, only instead of bonds and stocks, it was locks, passwords, and schedules. I decided that the second visit would be to Mr. Crane. He lived nearby, in the suburbs, on a 3-acre estate. I remembered his house in detail. He once boasted that he had a cellar where he stored wine and paintings. That's where what interested me was kept. Preparation took a week. I watched the house, studied the cameras, and the security guard schedule. Yes, he had security, but without much discipline. The guys working for him figured no one would break in on an old businessman in the middle of winter. I thought otherwise. I started the day of the operation by shaving. Yes, it's important. When you're committing a crime, you have to look neat. You never know what might happen. Then I put on a gray coat, gloves, a cap, and took a small backpack, the one I used to carry documents to the bank in. Strangely, I felt something akin to calm, like before an important client meeting. At 10 p.m., I stood by the fence, a slight frost, my breath steaming. The house was dark, only one window lit up, probably the TV. I waited. Then I moved. I slipped through the old gate into the yard, stepping onto the lawn, which crunched quietly underfoot. Everything seemed incredibly simple, as if I was just opening a deposit account again, only not at the bank, but in someone else's living room. The key moment, the old lock on the cellar door. I remembered Crane once boasting, "This lock was custom-made in Italy, Harry. It's impossible to open without the code." He told me the code then, as a joke, over a glass of wine, and I, being a banker, just filed it away in my memory. Now, that joke was working for me. 4729. Click! The door opened with such satisfaction that I could almost hear applause. The cellar greeted me with the smell of old wood and dust. Bottles of wine stood on the shelves, and a few canvases covered with cloth were in the corner. I walked over, lifted one piece of cloth. A portrait of a self-satisfied man in a top hat appeared before me, clearly worth a pretty penny. And that's when I laughed for the first time that evening, loudly, genuinely, the way I hadn't laughed in ages. I took a bottle of wine, opened it, and took a sip right there in the dark. "To old times, Mr. Crane," I mumbled, raising the bottle. Then I carefully took a small canvas off the wall, not the most valuable, but perfectly respectable, wrapped it in my coat, and walked away, leaving my old bank business card on the shelf. Let them think it's a sign. I wanted them to know they weren't being robbed by an ordinary thief, but by a former banker, a man of the system who simply changed sides. By the time I got home, it was already dawn. The first rays of sun fell on the painting leaning against the wall in my living room. I sat in my armchair, drinking coffee and looking at it as if it were proof that I was still alive. Only then did I feel it. I wasn't sad anymore. I was interested. I thought it would be a one-time adventure, a small rebellion against routine. But it turned out differently, because that morning, when I heard the news on TV, local businessman robbed, police suspect a professional, I laughed a real laugh for the first time in a long time. It seemed life had finally remembered me. From that moment on, I started noticing details I had previously ignored. People wearing designer coats and looking down their noses, cars that cost more than my house, apartments with a river view where my former clients once lived. They all looked calm, overconfident, and I was cheerful. I didn't feel guilty, honestly. They took much more than I ever could. I just took what was probably mine anyway, a slice of justice. Banking logic. The balance has to check out. When I finished my coffee, I already knew who I was going to visit next. Her name was Rachel Goodman. She once told me, "Harry, I have everything under control in my life. Absolutely everything." Words like that sounded like a challenge to me. I decided to check just how much control Rachel had now. And while I took out my notepad to make a few notes, I realized how much I loved the word plan. A plan is not a crime. It's just an idea waiting for its execution. And I, Harry Miller, intended to execute them as long as I had the mind, the time, and the coffee. People get second chances, second marriages, second careers. I got a second youth. That sounds dramatic,
But in my case, all I need are words that sound like self-justification. I say second youth so I don't have to say second crime spree, because that sounds unnecessarily tragic. When you're 68 and you start doing things you never dreamed of doing in your youth, you figure it should be less vivid. Yet, I felt I had never been so prominent in my own life. Everything that was once buried under tons of figures, statistics, and cold decisions was now awake like a feverish child, raw, curious, and a little ill-mannered. After the first sailboat and a single painting, I realized one simple thing. Nothing restores a sense of your own importance like an action that has consequences. People always talk about meaning. I found it in the word impact. Unlike a pension check, impact doesn't bring taxes, but it gives you that quiet, funny satisfaction when you realize I can make a move and someone else will react. So I started investing in myself, not in stocks, not in bonds, but in roots and rituals. My schedule was simple, almost like a financial calendar. Target review on Monday, reconnaissance on Tuesday, night visit on Thursday, recovery on Friday. Sunday, coffee with myself, and a recalculation of the emotions gained. Money was still in our lives. Pension, small savings, dividends. But now it played a secondary role. The primary role belonged to the art of planning. I sat for hours at the table in my living room with an old city map, a notepad, a formally signed coffee cup, and the exact same feeling I used to get before an important meeting with a major client. Only the goal was different. Control not over their investments, but over the events that could strike fear into someone's eyes. I felt a surge of courage. It wasn't exactly adrenaline, more like a higher form of intellectual mischief. You set a complex problem for yourself and solve it using accumulated knowledge. The absence of violence and the feeling of refinement in my actions were my ethical boundaries. I considered myself an eminent rationalist, and even in criminal activity, I aimed for it to look like a poorly executed non-working deal, elegant and formal. Local papers gave me a nickname, the Invisible Banker, but over time it became the Banker Thief, and I liked it. People at the bar would nod at me when I walked in. "Oh, he's the guy in the news." No, they didn't say that, but their eyes held something between respect and suspicion. My fame was small, but I felt like I had finally been given a place in the gestalt that I hadn't gotten before. The role of someone who broke the mold. Ultimately, a second youth isn't about physical capability. It's about the return of conscious engagement. I started wearing different clothes, not because I wanted to change my look, but to see how people's attitudes toward me would change. A new coat, not too flashy, but tasteful. A hat that nicely hid my face. Gloves, the same gloves I once used when reviewing papers, now as props. My appearance worked for me just as reputation once did. Of course, not all evenings were dramatic. Many times I sat alone at home, and my secondary self searched for justifications in old notes, looking for logical arguments. I'm not stealing, I'm restoring balance. I'm taking from someone who already took from others. Who will see this? A distant society that long forgot about me. It sounded like a fabrication for the conscience, but some part of it is necessary. Even a fraudster needs his own rational framework. My operations became more complex. Now I wasn't just taking a small item or a painting. I started studying the mechanisms of access to private safes, collections, and art. I learned to read people's routines, just like I once read their credit history. Someone went out every evening to feed the pigeons. That gave me a window for approach. Someone had a caretaker who didn't believe anyone could be suspicious. Someone kept their keys under a rock at night. Seriously. and then I'd think how funny that would look in my notebook under the heading Mistakes of the Rich. But more important than the technique was the reaction. Picture this. You make a small gesture. You take an object without destroying anything, and then you watch how people react. They start searching. They call the police. They raise their mood to alarm. A topic is added to their day, and that's the bread you're mixing into their lives. I liked it. I felt like an author, editing someone else's script. There were dangers, of course. The police aren't stupid. They gathered for meetings, exchanged theories, joked about a professional thief with good manners. The one time I met an officer who looked a little more attentive than the others, I smiled and said, "An interesting case here. Maybe it's a forgery." He smiled back, as if agreeing that a lot in this life is a forgery. I felt like I was playing a game where the rules were being written as I went, and that was the main temptation. However, a second youth has another side: community. You find those who play the same games, not necessarily criminal, but those looking for a feeling, who want to step outside the Procrustean bed of retirement. I started meeting people at the chess club. No, I hadn't suddenly stopped loving chess, and there were old companions who preferred smart conversations. One of them, a former local newspaper reporter, brought up the topic of missing items and said with a smile, "It's funny how people only value what they have when it's gone." He didn't know he was saying it because he'd already mimicked me in a letter, but he gave me an idea. How many more things could be made absent for the world to notice? But fate knows how to twist a joke. My happiness lasted as long as the balance between confidence and overconfidence held. One evening, I made a small mistake. Not technical at all, but human. I left a business card on someone's table. Yes, my stupid habit of leaving my credentials. I thought it was a chic gesture. You're dealing with a sophisticated banker. Instead, it gave the police a small lead. Someone started connecting the dots. Someone saw a person who looked like me. Someone noticed the hat. Someone already felt that bank and thief had some semantic connection. It was a house of cards that was starting to shake. Here begins the other aspect of a second youth: learning to manage attention. If you want to stay in the game, you have to be a master of attention, understanding when to leave traces and when not to, when to show that you are just a romantic in criminal clothes, and when to be a decisive strategist. I started applying banking approaches to information, diversifying targets, reducing risk correlation, hedging through small errors that diverted attention from the big ones. And the most paradoxical thing, I started to laugh again, laughing at the absurdity of the situation. An old banker in a hat taking a canvas worth more than his pension out of a cellar. It was funny as a tragedy or tragic as a comedy. I allowed myself to joke with myself out loud, say, when I stood in the kitchen making toast and talking to the painting, "You're in my portfolio now, old friend." The painting didn't talk back to anyone, but I was no longer alone in the silence. I had secrets, and that was company. The second youth lasted like a short series. Each visit gave me a new lesson. I learned not to make impulsive moves. I learned to listen to other people's instincts. I learned to admit that sometimes you have to retreat. And I learned that morality isn't always a straight path. Sometimes it's a soft, winding corridor where you're looking for the person you want to see in yourself. Of course, there was a shadow. I understood that if I continued, the end might come. But the end didn't seem bad to me then. What was bad was living as if you were already gone. Better to live and risk. Better to feel present. And if that meant taking a few other people's things, then maybe that was the payment for the return of the feeling of life. You can judge, and judge harshly, but judges were once young too, so who are we to judge? Winter was slowly setting in outside. The city was covered with a thin layer of morning frost, Shop windows twinkled with holiday lights. People hurried, carrying packages, and they didn't suspect that among them walked an old banker in a coat who had found his second wind. And it was a beautiful feeling, almost like buying a stock right before the market soars. Only here, the return wasn't monetary. It was something terribly close to joy.
I never thought that old age would bring me such an emotional spectrum. When you're pushing 70, you get used to a day being a cup of coffee, a touch of arthritis, and memories of people who've either died or moved to Florida. But now, every day started with a real adrenaline rush and ended with the feeling that I was either a genius or a complete idiot. They started calling me the banking ghost. I heard it from a news anchor who pronounced it with the same inflection as serial killer. A ghost. Me, Harold Denton, who spent his life in Brooks Brothers suits with starched cuffs and a subtle scent of cigars. And now, a ghost. You know what the strangest part is? I actually liked it. I started reading articles about myself. That rare moment when ego and paranoia declared a temporary truce. An unknown perpetrator, likely older, is demonstrating knowledge of security systems and banking protocols. Well, at least they acknowledged the experience. Possibly a former banker. At that, I actually laughed out loud. Possibly. If they only knew how many evenings I sat with those clients, telling them where best to invest their money so it wouldn't get stolen. The irony, I figured, was probably giving me a standing ovation. But not everything was so brilliant. More and more often, I noticed my aging body starting to fail me. After one of my outings, I couldn't properly bend my knee for 3 days. I rubbed in the ointment and looked in the mirror, which reflected not a banking ghost, but a wrinkled man contemplating switching to a calmer trade, like, say, growing cacti. However, calm didn't suit me. The next target presented itself, Mr. Gilmore. I once helped him set up a trust fund for his grandkids, and he boasted about his new safe that no one could break. At the time, I politely smiled, but now that memory burned in my brain like a challenge. Gilmore lived in a colonial house with white pillars, the "I was in a mortgage ad" type. His security was for show, but I knew the weak spots. I was the one who once urged him not to cheap out on cameras, and he, of course, ignored the advice. That evening, I drove there in an old pickup. I brought a new work tool, a flashlight with a red filter, invisible to standard cameras. I moved silently, like a cat, though my joints creaked like a horror movie door. And then the first unforeseen thing happened. Through the window, I saw not an empty living room, but light and figures. 2 of them, Gilmore and some young woman. A new caregiver, perhaps? They were drinking wine. He was laughing. The scene was idyllic, like a commercial. And I suddenly felt odd. What was I doing here? I'd known this man for 20 years. We played golf, drank whiskey, discussed taxes, and now I was standing on his lawn in a black jacket, gloved like a movie bandit. But then he laughed again, that sound that always made my teeth clench a little bit. The same laugh he once used when he fired Julia, my assistant, because she wasn't attractive enough for the front office. And right then, something clicked. I climbed the steps, slid open an unlocked window, and within 2 minutes was standing in the study, where the safe stood like a monument to human arrogance. The safe was new, shiny, with a biometric lock. But I didn't need to crack it. I already knew how to open it. Gilmore was always afraid that if something happens to me, my wife won't know the code.
So he wrote it down on a sticky note under the keyboard. Classic. I opened the safe, and as the metal door slid open, the smell of banknotes hit me like perfume. Cold, familiar, slightly disgusting. I smiled, and then laughter echoed in the hallway. They were coming upstairs. I didn't have time. I grabbed a wad of bills, a few envelopes, and ridiculously, but somehow automatically, a silver lighter with his initials. Then I scrambled out the back window and tumbled onto the lawn like a clumsy gymnast. In the car, I sat for another 5 minutes, holding the haul on my lap, and suddenly I burst out laughing, loudly to the point of tears. It wasn't a criminal's laugh, but the laugh of a man who finally understood the absurdity of the moment. Me, an old banker who just robbed a safe he helped the man buy. The next day, I woke up with a sore back, but with a smile. I turned on the news and saw the anchor say, "Police are investigating another incident linked to the so-called banking ghost. Investigators speculate that the perpetrator may have professional knowledge of financial systems." Professional knowledge. Well, my career was finally being appreciated. And then I laughed again, because I remembered a simple truth I once told my clients. There is no such thing as an unopenable safe. There is only a person who hasn't found out yet that it can be opened.
Numbers never scared me. I was used to percentages, balances, credits, risks, and even small losses. It was all part of life, part of the game. But now, I looked at my own life and thought about something completely different. Not money, not things, but the feeling you get when you realize your game could end at any moment. After the Gilmore job, I returned to my apartment, where I usually sat in my old armchair with a cup of coffee and the notebook that had become a kind of diary, registering not figures, but stories. I opened it and reread the entries, small details, tiny victories, absurd mistakes that were saving me from police scrutiny. My phone vibrated. A message from an old friend I used to work with at the bank. "Harry, heard the news? You're in the spotlight. Be careful out there." I felt a slight pressure. Before, I would have dismissed it as a joke. Now, it was a warning. And yet, the desire to continue was stronger. I sat on the sofa, looking out the window at the night city. Its lights reflected in the puddles after the rain. And I thought, life is like those puddles, a reflection of everything we do, but a little blurred, a little imperfect. You can admire it for a long time, but sooner or later, you have to step into it. I remember the first time I took something that wasn't mine. Then it seemed just like a game, an ironic twist of fate. Now I felt it was something more. Not just an adrenaline burst, but a test of myself, my limits, my capacity to act. The art of planning and the test of self. I spent the following days planning. Every detail was important. Routes, schedules, observation. The police were working fast, but I was working smarter. I started using methods I hadn't applied before. Diversions, false leads, even small gifts for former clients, so they wouldn't suspect I was already nearby. My evenings were now filled with quiet irony. You sit in your chair, drink coffee, look out the city and realize you're part of a grand performance where the rules change every minute. The irony is, no one knows who the author of this show is. Perhaps it's just an old banker with a hat and gloves who feels alive for the first time in years. One evening, as I reviewed the notes, it dawned on me. Everything I'm doing is not just a crime. It's a test, an experiment. People are used to evaluating me as a banker, as a retiree, as an old man who is no longer capable of anything.
And I'm checking their assumptions. I'm checking myself. At that moment, I understood the main thing. If I continued, I had to be ready for everything. I could no longer afford carelessness. Every small thing could cost too much. And that didn't scare me. It just made everything more real. The calm before the storm. In the late evening, I stepped onto the balcony. The cold air hit my face, and I took a deep breath. The city buzzed below. Cars, people, music. All of it was part of a world I once understood by numbers and balances. Now I understood it by feelings. I sat down, lit an old cigar, and thought, the next move must be precise. There is no room for error. But at the same time, there was a childish joy in me. I had reclaimed the feeling of life, and that was more valuable than any money or painting. After an hour of silence, I opened the notebook and began drawing the diagram of a new plan. Every line, every figure, every note, they were markers of my attention, my mind, my creativity. And when I finished, I felt a slight satisfaction, similar to a smile in the mirror. I'm still here. I can still do it. I'm still playing. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, and I already knew any consequences weren't scary. The next stage awaited me. High risk, greater thrill, and perhaps the final adventure that would determine whether I left behind a legend or just an old banking joke. Then I turned off the light, took my hat and coat, and walked toward the unknown. The calm before the storm was here, and I was ready for what was coming.
When people say one last time, they often mean one last time before returning to the old life. For me, one last time meant something a bit different. It was the final time I wanted to feel that the very structure of the world, ethics, money, power, was subject to my influence. And if I had to pay the price for it, well, I would pay it openly. I didn't want to run and turn into a caricature of an old man who vanished into the fog. I wanted the story to be understood. The idea didn't come in a flash of madness. It brewed quietly, like coffee sediment, until I once again tasted the bitter flavor of justice. I was sitting by the window, watching the city lace itself with the morning lines of tram tracks, and I wondered, what do I truly want? Financial triumph? Recognition? Revenge? The answer was a mix of everything, but the main thing was the desire to expel that emptiness from myself, and ultimately to appear in the eyes of my former clients not as a powerless retiree, but as a person who had reclaimed the right to a voice. I was no longer aiming for trifles. My patterns became more complex. A few months in, and the methods of study, planning, and execution had turned into a small scientific discipline. But the drama suggested, the best finale isn't a box of jewelry, but a document. An old ledger where deals, contracts, and names were recorded that could explain why some people sat on their estates like mountains, and why those mountains were sometimes built on the bones of others. Maybe it was naivete, or my final idealistic prank, not just to take, but to show, to force the system to reflect upon itself. The final target, the bank's archive. So, the target was set, the archive, the very paper trap where loans were born, then claims, and finally hidden agreements. The archive of the bank where I had worked my entire life. Down in the basement was a folder I had once classified myself. Confidential. Clients. It held names, checks, signatures. There was enough to make some noise, and I needed noise, not to destroy, but to awaken,
so that those I had robbed or those who had robbed others would see their own reflection. The plan was ruthlessly simple in its outline and complex in its execution. I didn't want to send anyone to jail for satisfaction. I had no desire to become a judge and ultimately turn into what I condemned. I wanted the truth in the public domain, even if the truth was incomplete. The desire was simple: documents, press, truth. After that, let those with a conscience figure it out, and those with a lawyer. Preparation took weeks. I studied the routes of the night patrol, the security guard schedules, and the access system to the bank's basement. The bank had changed. It became even more sterile, even more cut off from people. But the weak spots remained in the heart of its safe rooms, as always: the human factor, paper trails, habits. I knew where marks that were meant to be seen by no one were once hidden. I knew which door would be easily opened by a former colleague who was trusted with the keys. I told no one. I didn't want to share this intimacy with others, not with my son, not with any friend. This was something better done alone. Purity of intent, even if the intent wasn't perfect. And I believed it was better to get those documents, and instead of selling, to release them to the public. Let the journalists figure it out. Let the auditors patch the holes. Let society decide how to punish. It seemed everything was under control, until a letter arrived. A short note in the mailbox. Not the message I expected at all. "Harry, stop this. You are risking too much. T." The signature, an initial I knew. T. That was Thomas, my former boss, a man who stood behind millions and always wore his corporate chill like a jacket over a jacket. I called. No one answered. The message registered as a warning, but a warning is not an order. Sometimes a good plan must include noise, and sometimes minimal chaos. The night before the operation, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid. Fear had long since become the collateral for creativity. But because I was curious. I felt like I was preparing for a meeting in the boardroom again. The same strategic build-up, the same small sense of drama. I put on my coat, tucked the note with names into my pocket, and walked out into the night, which smelled of gasoline and wet asphalt. At the bank, I had access. Not legal access. My badge was no longer valid, but I knew the ventilation system. I saw the old doors for technical staff, and I knew that the camera on the second floor looked not outward, but at the window when it wasn't adjusted. I got to the basement, quietly. The doors that were once just part of my routine work were now becoming the entrance to the performance. The archives smelled of old glue and labor. The papers there were like small bodies, pile after pile, page after page. I felt how each filed folder resonated. Sometimes beneath it lay someone else's mistakes. I found the right box labeled Confidential, Clients. It was filed by a hand I remembered. We once wrote figures into tables together, and sometimes those hands would dip directly into the ceramic ashtrays on my desk. Nostalgia makes hands lazy, but I had a goal now, and the goal was clear. I didn't take the whole archive, only what I felt was necessary. A few contracts, agreements, signed letters, reports of transactions that looked suspicious. I packed everything in a bag and walked out into the night. Outside, the air was cold, and in every breath cloud I saw my own image, an old man walking with papers that could set the city alight. And then the unpredictable happened. The cameras recorded me, not because of a technical malfunction, but just one of those accidents that turns a story into a crime bestseller. I saw a light flicker,
Somewhere on a phone, the crackle of messages. Somewhere far away, the sound of sirens that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat for a second. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. I stopped. I could have put the bag under a bench and ran into the night. I could have slowed my pace and given myself a chance. But at that moment, I understood that the whole point of my actions was not to remain unknown. I wanted the vision to be clear. I am not an invisible man. I am a man with a name. Let whoever draws conclusions do so, but let them be drawn after the documents appear in the public sphere. So I did what felt like the only right thing to me then. I did not run. I raised my hands and clearly stated into the night, I am not hiding. When the police surrounded me, I took off my hat and smiled. Not defiantly, but rather with the same tone I once used when sitting down at the negotiating table. Let's talk honestly. Before the interrogation, I felt an incredible clarity. There was something very cleansing in deciding to look the consequences in the eye. I didn't pretend to be a hero, and I didn't want to become a victim. I was a man who made a choice, and now I had to answer for it. "Why did you do it?" the investigator asked, and the usual response stirred in me. "Because I was bored." But the answer was actually longer and more complex. To force others to hear that there are voices in their papers that they have ignored, so that those who hid the holes could no longer hide behind laughter. The press put my words into headlines. Former banker turns himself in to expose debts. Some called me a daredevil, others an idiot who threw himself into the abyss. My family, my son who listened to all it over the phone from San Francisco, listened silently and was surprised. He's not dead to me. He's just part of the world that watched from the side. It was important to me that he heard, not how he judged. The most amazing moment was when I handed the documents not just to the police, but to two journalists I found among those who still believed in investigative reporting. I told them, "Show this to the people. I don't want to ruin lives. I want the truth to be visible." They took the materials, their eyes burning as if they held a sacred scroll. Then the headlines appeared quickly. People started reading. Some were shocked. Some were filled with shame.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more.